Welcome back to the Just AI podcast. I'm Paige Lord. I am your host, and this is where we have conversations at the intersection of justice and artificial intelligence. This episode is for the week of February 24th, 2025, and we are covering the top news stories that occurred in the last week. Super excited to be back with you folks. I just wanted to kick this off the top and let folks know who have been listening in the past that we are actually changing our format. And so one thing that we noticed, and we got some feedback from some folks and commissioned some feedback from some folks, but we just noticed that, the podcast was just running a little bit long. And so it was initially around 45 minutes, 50 minutes. We decided we're going to shorten it and focus on an episode that's around 25 minutes or less. And we're no longer following strictly the format of the newsletter. Now, all of the things we talk about on the Just AI podcast will be in that week's newsletter, but not all of the things that are in the newsletter are going to make it onto the Just AI podcast. And that's for us to be able to keep that shortened timeline so that people can get just the top news of the week. So if you are still interested in getting a more comprehensive look, I recommend taking a look at the Just AI newsletter. You can subscribe to that on Substack, and the link is in the show notes. The podcast is still going to cover the top AI, responsible AI, and AI policy stories of the week. And I'm still going to be sharing the why it matters and contextualizing these events for you so that you can understand why this actually matters for you in your life. The other thing that I'm changing is that I'm switching to audio only. So if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, that doesn't change anything for you. But if you have been watching on YouTube, I'm actually going to switch to a static image with a voiceover. And the reason is simply because it takes a long time to edit those videos. And this just simplifies things a little bit for me until I get to a place where I'm able to actually bring somebody in to do a little bit of that editing. As you guys know, I have a full-time job as well, in addition to running this business and launching this podcast and my newsletter and all of those things. And I want to make sure that I'm still able to do everything well. So I'm making some changes there. So these changes also allow me to have more time to do more deep dive episodes and YouTube videos on topics that need more attention. So things like AI and sustainability, and things like AI's benchmarking, for example, with generative AI. That's a video that takes a little bit more time and energy, not only to research, but to record. And we would want to have visuals for something like that. So this just gives me more time to focus on that. All right, so I kind of want to dive into everything. We've been following and talking about folks for Black History Month, and so I wanted to talk about Katherine Johnson. You may already be familiar with her work. She was born in 1918. She passed away in 2020, but she is highlighted in the film Hidden Figures. And for those of you who don't know, she was a pioneering Black woman in tech. She entered college when she was 15 years old, and at the time of her graduation, her only employment options were really teaching or nursing. And so she worked as a teacher, and then she applied for a job at the Langley Research Center, which eventually became a part of NASA. And in 1953, she began working as what was known as a human computer and calculated the flight path for the first NASA mission to space. Her calculations were, as you can see in the movie Hidden Figures, super essential to the success of those early missions like Project Mercury and Apollo 11. And then when they actually brought in a machine computer, she helped confirm the accuracy of the machine computers. And then in 2015, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama. The source I use for this story is Purpose Jobs. I've put that in the show notes so you can take a look there. All right, so let's dive into it. I want to talk about some of the notable news of the week. The Majorana chip was announced by Microsoft. So they announced the launch of this Majorana 1 chip, which is the world's first quantum computing chip that's powered by a new topological core architecture. For those of you who don't know, I work for GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft. I always like to be transparent about that off the top. So Microsoft has been researching potential quantum breakthroughs and topological qubits in particular for over 20 years. So this announcement was a long time coming for them, very significant. And I really want to recommend, if you're looking for a deep dive on this, Meg McNulty's blog Cypher Talk on Substack. She released a new edition a couple of days ago, and she dives into quantum computing more in depth if that's something that you're interested in. I'm not able to do a deep dive on quantum computing, but the long and short of what I think people need to know about this announcement is that quantum computing is a way for us to solve very complex problems that traditional computers and humans cannot address. There are a lot of reasons why we might want to go the route of quantum computing and the types of things it could help with. One is that it could help us understand how materials suffer corrosion or cracks and potential ways to be able to mitigate that in the future. It can help us to identify a way to break down plastics into byproducts that would be more valuable for us to use, or to help develop non-toxic alternatives to plastics. This is something that's a big struggle because there are all different kinds of plastics out there, and there's not one cure-all solution for dealing with those plastics in a non-toxic way. So quantum computing could help us to get to those answers. And another example, and all three of these examples have come from the Microsoft blog, but another example is that quantum computing could be used to understand the behavior of enzymes, which could help with things like eradicating global hunger. It could boost soil fertility to improve the yield in a crop. And it could also promote the sustainable growth of foods in harsh climates. All of those things are very important to addressing global hunger. So there are a lot of uses for quantum computing, but the big focus, the big benefit is that it could help more quickly solve really major challenges that we deal with. The breakthrough from Microsoft is really meaningful for a couple of reasons. Qubits are critical to quantum computing, but they aren't governed by the law of physics that govern our world. They're governed by quantum mechanics, and they're also really finicky, and they're not very reliable. They're kind of blown and tossed by their environment. So if the environment isn't exactly right, all of that information in the qubit could be lost. And so Microsoft developed what they call topological qubits, which provide more stability for those qubits and make them more reliable. But because the particles that Microsoft sought to use hadn't been made before, they had to make them themselves. And these are called Majoranas. They were originally theorized in 1937, and they don't exist naturally in the world. They were in theory, and they need to be brought into existence with magnetic fields and superconductors. And Microsoft was able to achieve that. And they were able to achieve bringing the Majoranas into the world in a controlled environment that is less susceptible to sort of being disrupted by the energy around it. So a pretty major breakthrough for Microsoft to be able to have created these Majoranas. And basically, this discovery has led them down this path, or allowed them to be able to create a path that they're now following to building out a quantum computing chip, which is critical for quantum computing, that would have 1 million qubits on it. Why 1 million qubits? I think a lot of people are wondering that question. And the long and short of it is that you need to have at least 1 million qubits on a quantum computing chip in order to be able to actually make meaningful movement toward quantum computing that could actually solve these major problems in the world. So it's not enough to just have a quantum computer that can do some stuff. They want to build a quantum computer that can really tackle these massive challenges in the world and solve these massive problems. And in order to do that, you have to have at least 1 million qubits. So Microsoft had this major breakthrough. They're not to 1 million qubits on the chip, but they're definitely a lot closer, and they're continuing to build momentum on that. Why does this matter? A great question. One is that quantum computing can partner with artificial intelligence. It can enhance machine learning. It can solve challenging problems. And, it's really important for the future of problem solving, and can partner really well with artificial intelligence. The second thing is that quantum computing, it may not be artificial intelligence, but it is technology. And we should always be considering tech ethics and responsible tech when we're considering these new technologies and the way that they could impact the world. Because technology of any kind can be used as a tool or a weapon, it's important for us to not only understand the way that this could benefit the world, but also be keeping an eye out for the way that this technology, as it becomes less expensive and as it scales more broadly, can actually negatively impact the world when it's in the hands of bad actors. And then also we have to talk about the environmental cost. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the environmental cost, but you should know that qubits, for them to be able to function properly, have to be at absolute zero, which is not 0 degrees Fahrenheit, it's negative 460 degrees Fahrenheit. And it takes a lot of energy to get something to be that cool. I think that with technology that can change the world, the temptation there is just to highlight the ways that it can positively impact the world, and just sort of shy away from looking at the ways that it could have a negative impact on its path to having a positive impact. Okay, diving into responsible AI, I want to talk about Grok 3, and this is Elon Musk's latest AI model. It has landed. It has come with controversy. Of course, last week I talked about the controversy of Elon calling this, quote, the smartest AI on Earth. And last week I said that this doesn't hold a lot of water because this is puffery. There has been no set standard of what makes AI, quote unquote, the smartest. What even is that? Is it based on math or is it based on emotional intelligence? Like, what is that standard? The other thing is that a lot of these benchmarking techniques for AI are hugely contested. And I do want to issue a correction. Last week, I said that Elon hadn't released benchmark results for his AI, and that was true at the time of the recording of last week's episode, but not true at the time of the podcast release. So if you were listening last week and you heard me say there's no benchmarking that he released for this, that was incorrect, and I'm so sorry about that. There was benchmarking, but there's an issue with the benchmarking, and I wanted to make sure that we address that. So Grok 3 Beta and Grok 3 Mini were compared against a number of other models, OpenAI O1 Medium, O3 Mini High, O3 Mini Medium, Gemini 2.0 Flash, and DeepSeek R1. So it was compared in their blog post across a number of benchmarks and across all of these models. The controversy is that specifically for what's known as the AIME 2025 benchmark. This is a mathematics benchmark for testing AI models. When you test your model against this benchmark, you get a certain number of tries to be able to see what your final percentage score is. You can either test your model across all of the questions in the AIME 2025 benchmark one time, or you can test your model across all of those questions in the AIME 2025 model 64 times. Obviously, if you test your model against it 64 times, and then you take the consensus of the right answers across all of those questions, that gives you a better chance at having a higher score versus your model just getting one shot at each question. So that's an important distinction to know. In the AIME bar chart that XAI shared in their blog post, they shared their Grok score at what's known as consensus at 64, which basically means that their score was based on their model trying each of the questions in the AIME 2025 64 times. But they compared it against OpenAI O3 Mini High's AIME score at consensus at 1. So it wasn't an apples to apples comparison. Basically, in this bar chart, they compared Grok's ability to be able to get the answers right after 64 tries per question against OpenAI O3 Mini High's ability to get the answer right after one shot at every question. And people were quick to point out that O3 Mini High's AIME 2025 score at consensus at 64, or their results after 64 tries across each question, was higher than Grok's score. So a little bit of misleading information in there. You can take a look at my newsletter if you want to dive a little bit deeper into that and how these things go. But why does this matter right now? This matters because there are a lot of people out there, not just Elon Musk, but a lot of people who are trying to spin false narratives, who are willing to fudge the numbers, who are willing to change the information in order to make it look like they've created something that's the best. And data matters. So I would just encourage people not to be fooled by the graphs and to make sure that you're fact-checking the numbers, but also remember that the benchmarks themselves are somewhat arbitrary. You may be able to say this is the smartest AI on earth when it comes to these types of math problems, but there are all different kinds of intelligence. It's not just mathematics. AI researcher Nathan Lambert pointed out in this article, which is also linked in the newsletter, that the most important metric is probably the computational and monetary costs that it took for each model to achieve its best score. So it's not necessarily about the score itself. It's about how much money and how many resources went into being able to build that model so that it could achieve that score, because cost does matter. So benchmarks don't speak to models' limitations and strengths across the board. Take it all with a grain of salt. Diving into our AI policy news, I wanted to share that OpenAI uncovered evidence of an AI-powered Chinese surveillance tool to gather real-time reports about anti-Chinese posts on social media in Western countries. So researchers at OpenAI said that they've discovered this new campaign, which they call, quote, peer review, because they discovered it when someone was working on a tool that used OpenAI's technology to debug some of the code for that Chinese surveillance tool. And according to the OpenAI principal researcher, his name is Ben Nemo, this is the first time that they've actually uncovered this type of AI-powered surveillance tool. And from the information that they have, OpenAI believes that the surveillance tool was built on Meta's Llama model, which is famously open sourced. Now, this isn't the first time that OpenAI has spotted these types of campaigns coming out of China. One was called Sponsored Discontent. They used OpenAI's technology to generate English language posts that criticized Chinese dissidents. Chinese dissidents are, of course, folks from China who are now living in other places around the world and who are critical of the Chinese government. So this specific campaign was meant to criticize those individuals who are criticizing the Chinese government. And then the second one was a scam which OpenAI believes was coming out of Cambodia, and this uses OpenAI technology to generate and translate social media comments that help drive a scam known as pig butchering. This is a tactic used to woo specifically men on the internet and to entangle them in investment schemes, usually related to cryptocurrency. There were 3 takeaways for me from this story. The first one is that you really have to be careful about how you're using artificial intelligence. This article, to a degree, is an admission that OpenAI is closely monitoring the uses of artificial intelligence. And in this case, the monitoring certainly was beneficial because they uncovered this tool, but that's not the case for every company. So if you're using AI for personal use, it's less risky for you. I don't think that OpenAI is checking the personal uses of every single person. They're using artificial intelligence to scan for those scenarios that may be anomalies or dangerous. But if you're running a business or you are an employee and you are using, for example, OpenAI's technology or any other technology where you don't have a specific privacy contract in place, and you're sharing things like company secrets or proprietary code into the AI, that could lead to significant harm. So you've just got to be very, very careful about what you're putting into artificial intelligence. The second thing is that we know that AI can be used for good. I think it's important to call that out. This is a podcast where we typically talk about the darker side of artificial intelligence, but this is one way that artificial intelligence was actually used for good and was able to uncover these surveillance tools. And the third takeaway for me on this story is that you've got to talk to your family about scams. I'm going to link to this New York Times article about pig butchering, but it's this really in-depth look about how a scam started on the internet and led to the loss of $30 million from a small bank in a heartland community in Kansas. And it was a really interesting article about how one man was scammed and it essentially took down an entire community of individuals. Definitely make sure that you are talking to your people about all of the different ways that they could be scammed with artificial intelligence. Next up in AI policy news is that the trial has begun for a political consultant. His name is Steve Kramer, who is accused of sending AI-generated robocalls mimicking Joe Biden during the presidential primary. And this happened in 2024. I reported on it when it happened, but it was 2 days before the first in the nation primary for the presidential election in New Hampshire. And a robocall went out to thousands of New Hampshire voters. They're estimating between 5,000 and 25,000, urging them not to participate in the primary. And there are 3 parties that are implicated in the misuse of AI, but I'm going to focus today on Steve Kramer. And he is a Democratic political consultant, and he admitted to sending the AI-generated robocalls. Now, he did hire a magician, and I did have to read that a couple of times to make sure I read that correctly. He hired a magician to create the AI-generated soundbite. And then he also used a Texas-based company called Lingo Telecom who transmitted the calls. And the trial that we're talking about right now is focused on Steve Kramer. He's facing a $6 million fine from the FCC. And that fine is the first of its kind involving AI technology. So it's a significant moment. And then he's facing 13 criminal charges, which are felony charges, and 13 misdemeanor charges as well. And he claims that he created the calls as a stunt to demonstrate the need to regulate AI technology. This matters for a lot of reasons, but the biggest one, I think, is that this is a terrible misuse of artificial intelligence. Even if it was meant to be a political statement, this interfered with the process of democracy. Whether it's a robocall that would have been in President Biden's voice or in President Trump's voice and sent out to the people, it doesn't matter. It still interferes with the process of democracy. And so something for folks to keep in mind, make sure that when you receive those robocalls and you're listening to them, especially around times of elections, make sure that you are just thoughtfully considering, critically evaluating when you receive a call of that nature and really asking the question, is this truly something that this person would actually have said? And do not, you guys, please do not use artificial intelligence to try to prove a point about AI regulation. There are other paths to AI regulation, and we knew it was going to be a long haul. We know there needs to be AI regulation. We know it's going to be a long haul until we get to that point. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the EU withdrawing its AI liability proposal. So the EU is withdrawing its proposed regulations for handling victims' claims of harm caused by AI. Last week, it was taken off of the 2025 work program of the European Commission. The AI liability directive is really important because it plays a critical role in protecting victims of AI misuse. When you talk about the EU AI Act, we know that there are companies who are going to violate the terms of the EU AI Act, and then they will be required to pay out X million dollars to the EU. But what happens when a company who's doing business in the EU, their AI actually causes harm to an individual? There has to be some path to remedy for that, and this was the AI Liability Directive. The AI Liability Directive was created with the intention of protecting victims by making it easier for them to prove that they were harmed. So you can't just come out and say, this AI caused harm in my life. You have to have a way to prove it. But if the technology companies get to keep all of their information about their technology in a black box and they never have to share that sort of under the guise of company secrets, then that means that individuals who are truly harmed by artificial intelligence don't really have much of a path to remedy because they can't really prove in some cases the harm. So this AI liability directive was actually taken off of the table. And Axel Voss, who's a member of the European Parliament, pushed back against this change, stating, quote, "Why the sudden U-turn? The answer likely lies in pressure from industry lobbyists who view any liability rules as an existential threat to their business models. Big tech firms are terrified of a legal landscape where they could be held accountable for the harms their AI systems cause. Instead of standing up to them, the Commission has caved, throwing European businesses and consumers under the bus in the process." End quote. So this doesn't mean that this is off the table completely. It doesn't mean that they've just thrown it out. It just means it's not on the docket for work in 2025. But we know that the longer these things are delayed, the less likely they are to come to fruition. And the European Commission, for their part, said that there was just a lack of progress in the negotiations related to the directive, and that was their reason for pulling it off of the work list. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this matters. I just addressed one of them, which is it makes it so that there's not really a clear path to remedy for victims, individual victims of AI harms in the EU. The second thing is that there's also a chance that the removal of this from the work docket is due to conversations at the AI Action Summit in Paris, where the EU acknowledged that there was a ton of red tape and overlapping rules, making it really hard for companies to do business in the EU. And they're really committed to fixing that. So this could actually have been a move on the part of the European Commission, basically saying, like, it's already too complicated, and adding in this individual level of protection would make it even more complicated. And we promised that we would fix that. So we don't know that for sure. That's just speculation on my part, but that's something for us to also consider, especially as the political winds are changing right now, certainly in the United States. And that's definitely impacting the way things are operating across the world, as well as people are trying to figure out which partnerships they want to have and how to keep those partnerships. And that is all we have for the Just AI podcast this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure that you rate, review, subscribe, follow. Make sure that you are subscribed to the Just AI newsletter on Substack. And if you have feedback, make sure that you send that in hello@justaimedia.ai. You can also check out our website, justaimedia.ai, and take a look at our speaker page. I offer speaking services if that's something that's interesting to you, or you are looking for a responsible AI speaker at one of your next events. Take a look at that. I would be happy to have a conversation about that. And I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Cheers.